There's a new podcast style that keeps blowing up for business owners and experts like Laura, who blew up her podcast past 60,000 monthly listens and earned over $100,000 last year from her show. Or Kyle and John, who blew up their podcast past 18,000 monthly listens and added over $1 million in pipeline value to their business.
And none of this happened because they interviewed celebrity guests or had a massive following prior to launching their shows. In fact, they all had basically no following when starting. It happened because they all followed the exact same podcast style that actually works to make money. So in this video, you'll discover the exact style they're using to blow up, why interview podcasts are the fastest way to wreck your authority as an expert, and finally, the growth strategy they're using that makes it almost impossible for them not to blow up, even if you're starting with 0 followers online.
So look, this podcast style that's currently blowing up is split up into 3 main parts, starting with part 1. The format. The podcasts that are blowing up right now are ditching the traditional podcasting format, which is the typical Stephen Bartlett, Joe Rogan, and Call Her Daddy.
Call Her Daddy?
And they're doing something completely different, leaning more into solo podcast formats instead, where they don't have guests onto their podcast.
Now, here's what I find interesting. After working with over 300 business owners and experts, the number one reason these podcasts don't grow or make money is because they choose this interview format for a business goal that was never designed to solve. Meaning they think they're building authority, but actually they're building everyone else's authority but their own.
So instead of becoming the expert the audience wants to buy from, they spend months, sometimes years, building up their guest authority and then stay stuck with a podcast that looks like an authority but doesn't grow their business. Now I'm going to show you what I mean. One of our clients, Joshua, spent 2 years interviewing guests on his podcast, believing that was going to provide value and grow his business over time. Now, he did provide a ton of value, but his listenership wasn't growing and his sales were dead too. So we encouraged him to record a solo podcast episode by himself without guests, since that format wasn't working to drive sales for his business. Now, to begin with, he gave us some pushback because the whole reason why he started a podcast in the first place was because he wanted to have great conversations. But after having many and failing to grow his audience and business, he decided to give solo episodes a try. And within the first week, he earned $16,000 from his show, which was more money in 7 days than he had ever made in the previous 2 years of doing his podcast combined.
And he got these results because solo podcast episodes gave him something every host needs to drive sales, which is something we know as authority positioning.
This is where an audience sees you as an expert they should buy from to solve their painful problem. This is why so many celebrities and industry leaders go on what they call pod tours, where they guest on a bunch of different shows over a couple of months in order to boost their authority positioning. So while interview-based podcasts are great for you if you're the one being a guest on someone else's podcast, they are terrible for you as a business owner because you're the one left building everyone else's authority but your own. So by the end of the episode, listeners end up wanting to work with your guest and not you.
And that's why so many experts blowing up have ditched the traditional interview-based podcast format and switched to a solo podcast format instead, because they recognize that if they want to build their own personal brand and grow their business, they need to start platforming themselves, not their guests, where they will be the ones seen as the expert and authority the audience should listen to and buy from. But having a podcast style that blows up isn't just about having the right podcast format. There's actually 2 other key pieces that podcasts blowing up have in place that makes growing them 10 times easier and faster.
And that's where the second part of this podcast style comes into play. The podcast style that's blowing up right now are making it extremely easy and simple for total strangers to say yes to trying their show for the first time. But the problem is most experts launch hour-long podcasts because they've been conditioned to believe that's what real high-quality podcasts look like after seeing shows like Joe Rogan, Stephen Bartlett, and
Call Her Daddy.
Call Her Daddy, there we go. They assume that longer episodes equals better quality and faster growth, not realizing that this longer style of podcast only works when you're a celebrity that people already like, know, and trust. It wrecks your chances of ever blowing up if you're someone people don't know yet.
And it's because having hour-long episodes makes it impossible for new strangers to say yes to trying your podcast for the first time. It's kind of like trying to take someone out on a first date and then asking if they want to meet for a coffee nearby or spend a week with you in France. Obviously, one of these feels pretty doable and the other sounds like a giant commitment that most people will just reject.
And that's what happens when you offer someone who doesn't know you yet an hour-long podcast versus a 15-minute one. They'll usually try the short one because it feels like a smaller commitment. Now, celebrities can get away with much longer episodes because people already know who they are. So it doesn't feel like a risk or a gamble to invest that time.
But if you're not a celebrity, you don't have that same privilege. And that's why the podcasts blowing up businesses are shorter 15-minute episodes, because they just make it way easier for new people to try the show, which of course makes growing it so much faster. You'd be surprised at how few business owners know about this, because the gurus would have you think that if your podcasts aren't at least an hour long, you can't clip up your show, distribute it everywhere, get the best long-form content, and all that propaganda. Yes, propaganda that you've heard 1,000 times.
For us, honestly, that sounds like a total headache. When we started our podcast, we just wanted a simple way to build our personal brand, become recognized authorities in our industry, and drive more sales for our business, but doing it in a way that was actually fun and fit our already busy schedule without taking over our lives. Now, here's something to be aware of. You can only gain traction if you have a way to consistently get exposure for your show. Because even with the perfect episode format and length, you can blow up a podcast or business that nobody finds.
And this is where most experts get completely stuck again. They think growth comes from posting more clips, promoting, and just shouting as loud as you can. But the podcasts that are blowing up are actually following a lazier approach that makes it almost impossible for them not to blow up, even when starting with just no followers online. Like Todd here, who went from 500 to 12,000 monthly listens by shortcutting his way to page 1 of Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And this crazy growth is only made possible because of this graph here, which shows that the number one way that people find new podcasts to listen to is by browsing on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Now think about every other way you've been told to grow. Social media, ads, posting short form content. What do all of them have in common?
I hate them.
You do hate them, don't you? But no, not quite, Tig. You're essentially interrupting someone who wasn't looking for you. You're chasing attention and playing the algorithm game. And if you've been playing that game of social media because everyone says you need to, but deep inside, you've been doing it just to do it and has never felt right to you, this would be why. And it's also why we absolutely love this new style of podcast instead of social media. Because when someone opens up and types in executive coaching podcast or leadership podcast, they're not being interrupted. They have a problem. They're actively looking for solutions. And all you have to do is simply show up when they're looking. And that's what we call demand capture. Capturing the attention of dream prospects at the exact moments when they have the highest level of commitment to solving their problems. Discovering this 5 years ago was huge for us because back then I just dropped out of university. Tig was still studying music, which he loved in his final year, while at the same time trying to build our business. And for the longest time, we struggled to grow our business and build up a name for ourselves as podcast growth and monetization experts because we didn't have a consistent way to get clients results.
In fact, we spent most of our time trying to help clients grow their show by posting on social media, which obviously didn't work. And then once we realized that the main way podcasts grew was by them being discovered on streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, we became completely obsessed. Like, our top priority became how we crack the algorithm, but not the social media algorithm, the Apple and Spotify algorithm, to get our clients ranked on page 1 for these platforms. The idea was simple. If we got our clients on page 1 of Apple and Spotify for the main topics they wanted to be known for, they would then be way easier to find and grow their reach exponentially.
So this was a simple process we followed. First, we'll figure out the exact keywords people were typing into Apple and Spotify to find shows like theirs. Then we'll add those keywords into their show name, episode titles, as well as their show description. After that, we kept publishing episodes around those topics so that Apple and Spotify could easily understand what their show was about and who their show was for. Now, over time, the show started ranking higher, getting more discovered by the right listeners, and eventually their shows did blow up. Now, most people don't know this, but Apple and Spotify work like Google, their search engines, meaning when someone types in leadership podcast, anxiety podcast into the search bar, the platform looks at your show name, episode title, and description to decide who to show. Now, most podcasts have no idea that this is how the algorithm works on Apple and Spotify. So they never optimize for it, and as a result, their shows stay invisible for years despite posting great content.
And that's exactly what happened to one of our clients, Raven, who was on the verge of quitting her show, stuck below 400 monthly listeners after 2 years of podcasting. But just after improving her podcast SEO, she broke past 23,000 monthly listeners and eventually launched a book off the back of her show, which made her thousands in sales because she now had the audience. But it was only possible by taking advantage of the #1 podcast discovery platform on earth. And that's exactly what podcasts that are blowing up are really doing. They're not on social media, they're creating podcasts that are optimized for discovery on Apple and Spotify. And then they rank on page 1 and are consistently found by thousands of new listeners every month. And those listeners, they binge their show, see them as the authority, and then want to buy from the host.
So here's what you've discovered. The podcast style that's blowing up are solo episodes, which means they give the host the authority positioning. This helps them drive more sales from their podcast. These are short 15-minute episodes that makes it easy and simple for new listeners to try, which helps them grow way faster compared to the longer traditional style of podcasts.
And finally, the podcasts that are blowing up make it impossible to not gain traction by optimizing for discovery on Apple and Spotify, so new listeners can constantly find their show at the exact point they are most motivated to find a new podcast to listen to, which is the simple system the business owners and experts are using to blow up their business with podcasts.
Now, you might be wondering, how can you launch a podcast like this for yourself? Well, that's exactly why we created the ultimate guide that walks you through the exact step-by-step process you can start taking today to launch your very own 15-minute podcast that blows up and drives more sales for your business. So click this video right here and watch the ultimate guide.